Why did they stand? Why, in the year 1177, did a column of less than 500 knights, led by a sickly 16-year-old leper king, turn to face an army of more than 26,000 of Saladin's finest warriors? Standard military doctrine both then and now would call it suicide, a rounding error in the grand calculus of war. Yet they did not just stand. They formed up, lowered their lances and charged. And what secret, unearthed from beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple decades earlier, gave a brotherhood of just 9 original knights the audacity to believe they could rewrite the laws of combat? The answer to both questions is the same. They were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History knows them simply as the Templars, and on that day at the Battle of Montchezard, they were not committing suicide. They were teaching a master class in terror. The air was thick with dust and the metallic scent of fear. The Mamluk vanguard, the elite slave soldiers of the Sultan's guard, saw them coming. A small, tight wedge of white-mantled riders, their blood-red crosses like open wounds against the stark fabric. There was no battle cry, no furious scream. There was only silence, a disciplined, unnatural silence that was more terrifying than any war horn. It was the sound of an engine of destruction, a human threshing machine spooling up to full power. This was not a charge of passionate, glory-seeking nobles. It was a cold, calculated application of force. Each knight was a component in a single weapon, each lance a sharpened tooth in the jaw of a predator. Could you face such a sight? Could you hold the line when a silent, living avalanche of steel and faith comes to claim your soul? They hit the Mamluk line not as a wave, but as a spear point. The impact was absolute. Lances splintered, shields shattered. Men and horses were thrown into the air like discarded toys. The Templar wedge did not stop. It did not slow. It ground forward, its momentum fueled by a discipline forged not in royal courts, but in the harshest monastic rule ever conceived. The Latin rule, their constitution, governed every waking moment. It dictated what they wore, what they ate, how they prayed, and how they fought. It stripped them of personal identity, of family, of possessions. It left them with only 2 things, their faith and their brotherhood. A Templar owned nothing, not even the horse he rode or the sword he carried. He was an asset belonging to the Order, and the Order's business was war. This was their monastery, the saddle, their choir, the clash of steel, their prayer, the whispered oath to never retreat, to never surrender, to fight until victory or death. Disobedience was punished by fasting, flogging, or expulsion into a world they had forsaken. Cowardice was a fate worse than death, a spiritual damnation from which there was no recovery. They were the first to charge and the last to leave the field. This creed transformed them from a mere bodyguard for pilgrims on the dusty roads to Jerusalem into the most feared heavy cavalry in the world. In less than a generation, 9 men had become an Iron Legion. The early years were a crucible. They learned their trade in brutal, anonymous skirmishes in the Judean hills and the deserts of the Outremer. They faced an enemy who was faster, who knew the land, and who fought with a ferocity born of defending their homes. The Templars adapted. They studied the tactics of their Turkic and Saracen foes. They learned the art of the feigned retreat, the ambush, the lightning raid. But they fused it with something the East had never seen, the unshakable, disciplined power of the European knightly charge perfected into a science. For a Templar, the sword was the key, and every Saracen fortress was a lock waiting to be picked. They were a paradox that the medieval world could barely comprehend. They were monks who shed blood. They were nobles who lived in poverty. They were warriors who sought spiritual purity through the act of killing. Each swing of their sword, they believed, was an act of worship. Each enemy slain was a step closer to salvation. This belief, this absolute conviction, made them fearless. How can you terrorize a man who believes that to die in battle is his ticket to paradise? You cannot. You can only kill him. And the Templars were notoriously difficult to kill. Their training was relentless. They practiced endlessly with lance, sword, and mace. They drilled formations until a squadron of 50 knights moved with the precision of a single organism. While other Crusader knights bickered over precedence and glory, the Templars moved as one. They understood that the strength of the wolf is the pack, and the strength of the pack is the wolf. This unity was their secret weapon, more potent than their hardened steel armor or their powerful war horses. It was a weapon of the mind, a psychological edge that often won the battle before the first blow was struck. The chronicles of the era, from both Christian and Muslim scribes, speak of them with a mixture of awe and dread. To William of Tyre, they were the bulwark of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the lions in war. To Arab historians like Ibn al-Athir, they were the fiercest fighters of all the Franks, demons in white, who fought with a satanic fury. The legends began to grow. It was said they could not be killed by conventional means, that they were protected by divine power. In reality, they died just like any other man. They simply died harder. The aftermath of their early battles was always the same, a field littered with the dead and a small contingent of white-mantled knights regrouping in disciplined order, their red crosses soaked a deeper crimson. They did not celebrate, they did not loot. They tended to their wounded, prayed for their dead, and prepared for the next fight. For a Templar, the war never ended. It was an eternal state of being, the purpose for which they were created. They were the iron fist of the Church, an order of warrior monks built for a single, brutal purpose, to hold the Holy Land or die trying. The world had never seen anything like them, and it never would again. Their very existence was a challenge to the established order, a new kind of power that answered only to the Pope, and perhaps to God himself. And as they honed their skills in the unforgiving laboratory of war, they were preparing for their masterpiece, the day they would face the greatest warrior of the age and show him the true meaning of faith converted into military force. What truly forged these men into a weapon that could shatter armies 10 times their size? Was it their unshakable faith in a divine mission, or the brutal, soul-crushing discipline that stripped them of all fear and doubt? Tell us in the comments what you believe is the greater catalyst for creating the perfect soldier. The ultimate test of this new doctrine of war came on that fateful November day at Montgisar. Sultan Saladin, the great unifier of the Muslim world, had made a critical error. Believing the main Crusader army was bottled up at Ascalon, he had allowed his vast force to spread out, to forage and pillage across the plains. His intelligence was good, but it failed to account for one thing: the sheer, insane audacity of the Templars. The Crusader force that intercepted him was a skeleton crew, a few hundred knights, a few thousand infantry, and at the very tip of the spear, 80 Templar brothers. 80, against an army that numbered in the tens of thousands. The decision to attack was not born of desperation, but of ice-cold tactical calculation. The Templars were masters of asymmetric warfare. They understood that in the desert, timing and shock are everything. They saw Saladin's army disorganized, strung out, its guard down. They saw the Sultan himself in a state of relaxed confidence. It was a fleeting moment of vulnerability, a crack in the armor of a giant. And in that moment, they chose to strike. What makes a person voluntarily walk towards certain death for the sake of an idea? For the Templars, the calculus was simple. A small chance of a total victory was preferable to the certainty of a slow, grinding defeat. They were gamblers playing for the highest stakes, the survival of the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself. Their charge was not aimed at the center of the Saracen army. That would have been folly. It was a decapitation strike aimed directly at Saladin's personal bodyguard. They moved with a terrifying economy of motion. There were no wasted movements, no hesitation. The knights formed a tight, 3-layered wedge. The front rank was made of the most experienced veterans, their lances held couched, turning the combined mass of horse and rider into a single, unstoppable projectile. The ranks behind them carried their lances vertically, a a forest of ash and steel, ready to drop them into place as the front rank broke through. This tactic, known as the Esnev, allowed them to maintain the charge's momentum, punching deeper and deeper into the enemy formation. The Saracen forces, caught completely by surprise, barely had time to form a line. The Templar wedge smashed into them with the force of a thunderbolt. The sound was a hideous symphony of splintering wood, screaming men, and the percussive thud of armored bodies colliding at full gallop. The Mamluks, who had never broken in battle, were shattered. The Templars carved a bloody path through them, their long swords rising and falling with methodical precision. They were not fighting as individuals. They were a single, cohesive unit, each knight protecting his brother, each movement part of a rehearsed and deadly dance. Saladin watched in disbelief as this tiny white comet streaked through his army directly towards him. He was a veteran of countless battles, a brilliant strategist, but he had never witnessed such disciplined ferocity. His own nephew was cut down before his eyes, his standard-bearer fell. Panic, the most contagious of battlefield diseases, began to spread through the Saracen ranks. Soldiers who had been moments from a glorious victory were now scrambling for their lives, convinced they were being attacked by the main Crusader army, or worse, by something not entirely human. The Saracens called them devils in white, and on that day, the name seemed horrifyingly apt. The charge created chaos, and the rest of the small Crusader force exploited it brilliantly. The infantry moved up to engage the disordered enemy, while the other knights slammed into the flanks. The battle devolved into a rout. An army of over 26,000 men was broken and scattered by a force a fraction of its size. Saladin himself only escaped capture by fleeing on a racing camel. He lost his personal guard, his baggage train, and most devastatingly his aura of invincibility. It was one of the most stunning upsets in military history, a victory against impossible odds. Montrizard became a legend, a testament to the Templars' unique brand of warfare. They had weaponized faith and discipline into a force multiplier that defied conventional military math. They proved that in the right circumstances, a handful of elite, highly motivated soldiers could defeat a multitude. They became the ultimate predators of the desert. They learned to read the terrain like a map, to use the sun and wind as allies, to strike from unexpected directions and vanish back into the arid landscape. They were a rapid reaction force, constantly patrolling the frontiers, their small detachments a constant threat to any raiding party. They didn't just fight in the desert, they made it their own. Their success was built on superior intelligence. Before any major operation, Templar scouts, often local Christians who spoke Arabic, would map the terrain, locate water sources, and monitor enemy movements. They knew the desert's secrets, its hidden wadis and secret passes. This knowledge allowed them to move faster and more discreetly than their enemies, appearing where they were least expected. This mastery of the environment, combined with their terrifying combat prowess, created a mystique that was as powerful as any weapon. An army marches on its stomach, but a legend marches in the minds of its enemies. But such spectacular victories, while legendary, were not a sustainable strategy for defending a kingdom. The Templars knew this. A charge, no matter how devastating, is a fleeting event. It cannot hold territory. It cannot secure a border. For that, you need something more permanent. You need stone. You need walls. You need fortresses so powerful they could serve as anchors for the entire defense of the Latin East, symbols of permanence in a land of shifting sands and ephemeral allegiances. Having perfected the sword, the Templars now turned their genius to the trowel. They built castles, but to call them mere castles is to do them a grave injustice. The structures the Templars erected across the Holy Land were not the drafty, inefficient keeps of their European counterparts. They were masterpieces of military engineering, machines for killing, designed with a cold, brutalist logic. These fortresses, Chastelblanc, Tortosa, Atlit, Safit, were the physical embodiment of the Order's own character, disciplined, impregnable, and lethal. They were the steel backbone of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a chain of stone sentinels glowering down from strategic heights, daring any army to try its luck. A tour of a Templar castle was a lesson in the science of defense. Take Safed, for example, perched high in the hills of Galilee, overlooking the road from Damascus. It was not a single castle, but a series of concentric rings of death. An attacker first had to contend with a massive outer wall, studded with projecting towers. These towers were not square, like in older designs. They were round or polygonal, angled to deflect projectiles and eliminate blind spots. They were positioned for interlocking fields of fire, meaning any attacker at the base of the wall would be peppered with arrows and stones from at least 2 directions. This was the first killing flaw. If, by some miracle, an attacker breached the outer wall, they were not inside the castle. They were trapped. They found themselves in a narrow, open space, the outer bailey, completely exposed to the even taller, even more formidable inner wall. This was the second killing flaw. Every inch of it was a calculated death trap. The main gate was a fortress in itself, protected by a drawbridge, a heavy portcullis, and murder holes in the ceiling, from which defenders could pour boiling oil, pitch, or drop heavy stones on anyone trapped in the passageway. The entire design was a testament to the Templar philosophy: make the enemy pay in blood for every single foot of ground. Inside, these castles were not just garrisons, they were self-contained cities. They housed hundreds of knights, sergeants, and mercenaries. They had vast cisterns to collect rainwater, ensuring a supply that could outlast any siege. They had granaries, forges, stables, and chapels. Secret passages and postern gates allowed defenders to launch surprise counterattacks or for messengers to slip out for reinforcements. These fortresses were the logistical hubs of the Templar war machine. From here, they controlled vast agricultural estates, their revenues funding the endless war. They were nodes in a network of power that stretched from the deserts of Palestine to the financial centers of London and Paris. The sieges of these fortresses became legendary. Muslim armies, masters of siege warfare themselves, found them to be infuriatingly tough nuts to crack. In 1266, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the age, arrived at the gates of Saft with a massive army. He expected a quick victory. Instead, he got a bloody lesson in Templar resolve. For weeks, his trebuchets battered the walls, his sappers tried to mine the foundations, and his elite troops launched wave after wave of assaults. The Templar garrison, vastly outnumbered, threw them back every time. Their defense was as disciplined and coordinated as their famous cavalry charge. These castles were more than military strongholds. They were statements. They were expressions of will, of an intent to remain. In a land where everything seemed temporary, they were symbols of permanence. They dominated the landscape, projecting power and control for miles around. For a pilgrim traveling the roads, the sight of a Templar banner flying from a distant watchtower was a symbol of safety. For a Saracen raiding party, it was a warning. The Templars understood that war is fought on 2 fronts, the physical battlefield and the psychological landscape. Their castles conquered both. For a Templar commander, his fortress was his shield. From its walls, he could watch the enemy, gather intelligence, and plan his next move. The stone walls protected not only men, but secrets. And in the complex, treacherous world of the Crusader states, secrets and intelligence were often more valuable than 1,000 swords. The pristine white mantle of the Templar concealed a world of shadows. While their public image was that of the pious, unyielding soldier of Christ, their survival in the intricate political landscape of the Middle East required a far more pragmatic and often ruthless approach. The Holy Land was not a simple battleground of cross versus crescent. It was a chaotic chessboard of shifting alliances, petty kingdoms, and rival factions on both sides. To navigate it, the Templars became masters of a different kind of warfare, the Shadow War. They built an intelligence network that was unrivaled in the Christian world, a web of spies, informants, and agents that stretched from the Sultan's court in Cairo to the mountain fortresses of Syria. Their most famous and enigmatic relationship was with the Order of Assassins. To the outside world, they were mortal enemies, 2 secretive, fanatically loyal military orders on opposite sides of a holy war. And they were. They fought each other with brutal efficiency on numerous occasions. Yet beneath the surface of open hostility lay a strange and complex connection built on a foundation of mutual professional respect. Both were elite, disciplined organizations that valued loyalty and secrecy above all else. They were the two most formidable special forces in the region, and like professional soldiers throughout history, they understood each other in a way that outsiders could not. There are documented instances of cooperation that would have shocked the pious donors back in Europe. The Templars and the Assassins occasionally concluded truces, exchanged information, and even formed temporary alliances against a common enemy. The Templar preceptories, their commanderies scattered throughout the Holy Land, were not just military bases, they were centers for gathering intelligence. The order actively recruited local Christians, Syriacs and Maronites who could blend in, speak the languages, and gather information. They had agents in every major city, listening in the marketplaces, bribing officials and reporting on troop movements and political intrigue. This information gave them a tremendous strategic advantage, allowing them to anticipate enemy attacks and exploit weaknesses. This pragmatism extended to outright diplomacy with Muslim powers. While the papacy preached crusade, the Templars on the ground often negotiated their own treaties with various Muslim emirs. They understood that survival sometimes depended on making a deal with one devil to fend off another. These alliances were purely practical, devoid of religious sentiment. If a treaty with the emir of Damascus could secure their northern border and allow them to focus their forces against the Sultan of Egypt, they would make it without hesitation. This realpolitik frequently put them at odds with the hot-headed, newly arrived Crusader kings from Europe who saw any negotiation with the infidel as a betrayal. But the Templars were playing a long game. Their true strength was not only in the sword, but also in the dagger hidden beneath the cloak. What would you do if you were in their position, facing overwhelming odds? Would you maintain your ideological purity, even if it meant certain destruction for your people? Or would you forge a pragmatic alliance with a sworn enemy in order to survive and fight another day? Let us know what choice the commander in you would make in the comments. Their involvement in the murky world of politics was not always defensive. The Order became a formidable political power in its own right, capable of making or breaking kings. They were king-makers and, when necessary, king-breakers. Their Grandmaster held a seat on the Haute Cour, the High Court of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and his vote carried immense weight. Their financial power gave them leverage over indebted nobles and monarchs. And if diplomacy and financial pressure failed, they were not above more direct methods. The assassination of Conrad of Montferrat, the newly elected King of Jerusalem, in 1192 has long been rumored to have been orchestrated by the assassins, but many historians suspect they were hired for the job. The question is, by whom? The Templars had both the motive and the connections to arrange such a hit. This shadow war created an aura of mystery and fear around the Order. People began to whisper that the Templars were not what they seemed, that their long years in the East had changed them, that they had adopted strange, unchristian customs. Their secret initiation ceremonies, their closed chapter meetings, and their exclusive allegiance to the Pope fueled paranoia and jealousy. They were accused of arrogance, of greed, and, most damningly, of heresy. The very pragmatism that allowed them to survive and thrive in the Holy Land was now being used as a weapon against them by their rivals in Europe. They were too rich, too powerful, too independent. But on the battlefield, none of that mattered. When the horns sounded for war, the Templars shed their cloaks of intrigue and donned their mantles of war, and all the whispers and rumors were drowned out by the thunder of their charge. Their identity as spies and diplomats was secondary to their primary function as the ultimate shock troops of the medieval world. Their entire organization, from the spies in Cairo to the bankers in Paris, was designed to support and enable one single defining event: the moment their battle standard was unfurled on the field of war. That standard was a weapon in itself. It was called the bosant, a simple banner of black over white. Its meaning was stark and uncompromising. The Templars were fierce and black to their enemies, but fair and white to their friends. When the baucent was raised, it was a focal point for the entire Christian army, a symbol that the elite were engaged. But for the enemy, it was a harbinger of doom. It signaled the imminent arrival of a silent, disciplined, and utterly relentless force. The raising of the baucent was the last thing many men ever saw. The combat doctrine of the Templars was built around this banner. As long as the baucent flew, they were forbidden to retreat or leave the field of battle. The standard-bearer was guarded by a special contingent of 10 knights. If he fell, another would immediately take his place. Only if the banner itself was captured or destroyed, and all seemed lost, could the remaining knights seek to join another Christian force, like that of the Hospitallers. But to simply break and run? Unthinkable. The rule was explicit. No brother was to leave the field as long as the baucent stood. This created a core of unbreakable troops at the heart of any Crusader army. While other formations might waver or break, the Templars were an immovable rock, an island of discipline in a sea of chaos. The charge itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Unlike other knights who would shout their family names or battle cries, the Templars charged in eerie silence. Imagine the scene from the perspective of a Saracen infantryman. You see a line of heavily armored knights, their faces hidden behind impassive steel helmets. Their white mantles billow, making them seem larger, almost spectral. They begin to move, first at a walk, then a trot, then a thunderous gallop. And there is no sound but the pounding of hundreds of hooves and the jingle of mail. The silence is unnatural, unnerving. It speaks of a cold professionalism, a complete lack of passion. They are not coming in anger. They are simply coming to kill you, as a woodsman comes to fell a tree. It was an execution, not a battle. Christian and Muslim chroniclers alike testify to the supernatural terror this silent charge inspired. It was designed to break an enemy's morale before the first lance ever struck home. The wedge formation they used was not just a tactic, it was a psychological tool. It focused all their force on a single point, creating the impression of an unstoppable, penetrating power. It was designed to make the enemy feel helpless, to convince them that their line was about to be punctured and they would be swallowed whole. Often the mere sight of the baucent advancing was enough to make militia units or less experienced cavalry turn and flee. Could you submit to a rule where the slightest disobedience is punished by expulsion and fleeing the battlefield by eternal shame? This iron discipline was the engine of their success, but it also contained the seeds of their greatest disaster. It created warriors of unparalleled courage, but it could not grant them immunity from the folly of their leaders. The Templar war machine was a perfect weapon, but a weapon is only as good as the hand that wields it. And in the summer of 1187, that hand was guided by pride, arrogance, and a fatal thirst for glory. The result would be the greatest catastrophe in the history of the Crusader states. It would happen on a barren, waterless plateau, under a merciless sun, at a place called the Horns of Hattin. The disaster at Hattin was not a simple military defeat, it was a self-inflicted wound, a suicide orchestrated by pride. The stage for the catastrophe was set by the internal politics of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a viper's nest of ambition and rivalry. The Grand Master of the Temple at the time was Gerard de Riedefort, a man whose personal history was deeply intertwined with the kingdom's political drama. He harbored a bitter personal grudge against Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most powerful and pragmatic nobles in the kingdom. This feud would prove to be fatal. When Saladin invaded Galilee, Raymond, whose lands were directly threatened, wisely counseled a defensive strategy. His plan was simple: let Saladin's army bake in the summer heat, let it exhaust its supplies, and avoid a pitched battle at all costs. The Crusader army was gathered at a well-watered position at Sephoria. It was a sound, logical plan, but Gerard de Riedefort would have none of it. In the royal council, he accused Raymond of cowardice and treason. He appealed to the vanity and insecurity of the king, Guy of Lusignan. He painted a glorious picture of a decisive victory, of crushing Saladin once and for all. He goaded the king, insisting that to not march out and meet the enemy would be an act of unforgivable shame. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation, fueled by his own reckless ambition and hatred for Raymond. Against all military sense, against the pleas of his most experienced advisors, King Guy listened to the Grand Master of the Temple. He gave the order to march. They were marching to their doom. The army left the springs of Sephoria and began a slow, agonizing march across a dry, sun-blasted plain towards the Sea of Galilee. Saladin's light cavalry swarmed around them, harassing them with arrows, setting fire to the dry brush, filling the air with smoke and choking dust. The heat was relentless. The soldiers, clad in heavy mail, began to suffer terribly from thirst. The Templars and Hospitallers formed the vanguard and the rearguard, the disciplined corps that held the crumbling army together. They fought with their customary bravery, but even they could not conjure water from stone. By the time the exhausted, dehydrated army camped for the night on the barren slopes near the twin hills, known as the Horns of Hattin, they were already beaten. They were surrounded without water, and their morale was shattered. The next day, July 4th, 1187, was a vision of hell. The Crusader army, tormented by thirst, tried to fight its way down to the Sea of Galilee, a shimmering mirage of salvation they would never reach. Saladin's forces pressed in from all sides. The battle was a confused, desperate melee fought in a haze of smoke and dust. The Christian infantry, maddened by thirst, broke and fled, scrambling up the slopes of the Horns, only to be surrounded and cut down. The knights, dismounted and fighting on foot, made several heroic but futile charges. At the center of it all, the Templars and Hospitallers made their last stand. They fought with the courage of despair. Surrounded, hopelessly outnumbered, they created a redoubt of shields and bodies around the king's red tent and the holiest relic of the kingdom, a fragment of the true cross. They knew there would be no escape. Their only remaining purpose was to die well. They were the Iron Legion, and even in annihilation, their discipline held. They fought until their swords were blunt and their arms were too weary to lift their shields. But it was not enough. The kingdom's army was wiped out. The king was captured, the true cross was lost, and Gerard de Riedfort, the architect of the disaster, was taken prisoner. Saladin, usually known for his chivalry, made a chilling exception for the Templars and Hospitallers. He considered the military orders to be the heart and soul of the Christian military effort, and he hated them with a cold fury. He offered the captured knights a choice: convert to Islam and live, or remain Christian and die. According to the chroniclers, to a man, they chose death. Over 200 knights of the temple and the hospital were led out and personally beheaded by Saladin's emirs and Sufi mystics. It was a ritualistic slaughter, a symbolic execution of the very idea of the holy warrior. Saladin knew that to truly defeat the Crusaders, he had to break their spirit. And the Templars were their spirit, forged in iron and faith. Hattin was more than a defeat. It was the apocalypse for the First Kingdom of Jerusalem. It seemed that the Order, born in the Holy Land, would now die there. But the Templars were not so easily extinguished. An idea backed by an international corporation is a hard thing to kill. The defeat at Hattin was a near fatal blow. The Order lost the bulk of its fighting strength in a single day. The kingdom collapsed, with Jerusalem itself falling to Saladin a few months later. All that remained of the Crusader states were a few coastal cities, most notably Tyre. It was the darkest hour, but the Templars possessed a resilience that was almost inhuman. Their strength was not just in their castles or their knights in the east. It was in their vast network of preceptories across Europe, a continent-spanning infrastructure that could generate wealth and manpower. While the field army was annihilated, the corporation endured. From the ashes of Hattin, the Order began the painstaking process of rebuilding, preparing for the inevitable Christian counterattack, the Third Crusade. When the kings of Europe finally arrived, led by the legendary Richard I of England, the Lionheart, they found a revitalized, albeit chastened, Templar order ready for war. The Templars became the vanguard of Richard's army, their knowledge of the local terrain and warfare indispensable. The relationship between the proud, impetuous English king and the disciplined, secretive military order was one of mutual respect, tinged with professional rivalry. Richard was a brilliant warrior, but he was also reckless. The Templars were the steady, professional hand that often tempered his fiery genius. This dynamic was on full display during the grueling 2-year siege of Acre. Acre was the most important port in the kingdom, and its recapture was the Crusades' primary objective. The fighting was brutal, a meat grinder of constant assaults, skirmishes, and disease. The Templars were at the forefront of every major attack, their engineering skills crucial in constructing siege engines and undermining the city's formidable walls. When Acre finally fell in 1191, it was a massive victory, and the Templars established their new headquarters within its walls. But the crusade was far from over. The next objective was Jerusalem itself. The march south from Acre to Jaffa was one of the most remarkable military operations of the Middle Ages. Richard's army hugged the coastline, supplied by his fleet, while Saladin's forces shadowed them, launching constant harassing attacks. The rearguard, the most dangerous position, was often entrusted to the Templars and Hospitallers. Their job was to absorb the Saracen attacks, to hold the line, and to prevent the Crusader column from being broken up and destroyed piecemeal. It required nerves of steel and perfect discipline. It was at the Battle of Arsuf that this discipline was put to its ultimate test. As the Crusader army marched past the forest of Arsuf, Saladin launched a massive, coordinated assault. His entire army descended upon the Crusader column. The fighting was fiercest at the rear, where the Hospitallers were being hammered relentlessly. They were taking heavy losses and were on the verge of breaking. Richard's plan was to endure the attacks until the enemy had spent its energy, and then launch a devastating, coordinated cavalry countercharge. But under the hail of arrows and constant charges, the Hospitallers' discipline snapped. They charged without orders, forcing Richard's hand. The entire Crusader line was now committed to a chaotic, premature battle. It was a moment that could have led to another Hattin. But it was the Templars, commanding the vanguard, who saved the day. While the center and rear of the army were in disarray, the Templars executed Richard's planned charge with textbook perfection. They wheeled their squadrons and smashed into the flank of Saladin's right wing with devastating force. Their disciplined, controlled charge shattered the enemy formation, relieving the pressure on the beleaguered Hospitallers and turning the tide of the battle. Arsuf was a resounding victory, a vindication of the Crusader military method, and a testament to the fact that even after Hattin, the Templars were still the most effective, heavy cavalry in the world. They had risen from the ashes, reforged in the fires of the Third Crusade, and once again stood as the primary military force in the Holy Land. Their resilience was phenomenal. But what truly powered this incredible comeback? Was it the charisma of a great leader like Richard the Lionheart, or the silent, unglamorous strength of an unbreakable institution like the Order itself? Share your thoughts in the comments. The secret to the Order's incredible resilience, its ability to absorb a catastrophic defeat like Hattin and emerge stronger than ever, did not lie solely on the battlefield. It lay in a revolutionary system they had perfected far from the deserts of Palestine, in the counting houses of Paris, London, and Rome. The Templars were not just monks and soldiers, they were the most sophisticated international bankers of their age. They had created a financial empire that was the true source of their power, an engine that turned the prayers of the faithful and the fears of the powerful into the gold that funded their endless war. Their war for faith was, ironically, the most profitable business of the 12th century. Their greatest financial innovation was born from a simple, practical need: protecting pilgrims. Traveling from Europe to the Holy Land was a long and perilous journey. Pilgrims who carried large sums of cash were easy targets for bandits. The Templars devised a brilliant solution. A pilgrim in London could deposit his gold at the local temple, and in return he would receive a letter of credit, a coded piece of parchment detailing the amount. He could then travel to the Holy Land with only this letter. Upon arriving in Acre or Jerusalem, he would present the letter at the Templar preceptory, and they would give him his money minus a service fee. It was, in effect, the world's first traveler's check. This system was a revolution in finance. It made travel safer and became immensely popular and hugely profitable for the order. But its true genius lay in its application to the business of war. The Templars used this same system to move vast sums of money across Europe to fund the Crusades. A king in France could deposit his funds with the Paris Temple, and the order would make the equivalent amount available to him in the Holy Land. This eliminated the massive risk and logistical nightmare of transporting chests of gold and silver across thousands of miles of dangerous territory. The Templars became the treasurers and paymasters of the Crusades, the logistical backbone of the entire enterprise. Their financial acumen grew from there. Their network of preceptories across Europe acted as a de facto chain of international banks. They engaged in lending, charging interest disguised as rent to circumvent the church's usury laws. They held valuables in safekeeping, managed estates for nobles who went on crusade, and acted as financial advisors and creditors to the most powerful people in Christendom. Kings and popes borrowed heavily from the Templars to finance their wars and run their kingdoms. At the height of their power, the Paris Temple was the treasury of the French monarchy. They were too big to fail. This river of gold flowed east, where it was transformed into the stone of fortresses and the steel of swords. A donation from a pious widow in England could buy the grain to feed the garrison at Safed. The profits from a vineyard in Burgundy could pay for the war horses used in a charge against the Sultan of Egypt. This was the true genius of the Templars. They created a self-sustaining system to fund a permanent war. While kings had to beg their nobles for funds for each new campaign, the Templars had a constant, reliable stream of income. They were the first transnational corporation, a private military enterprise with a global reach. This immense wealth and power, however, came at a price. It inspired awe, but also deep resentment and jealousy. They became a state within a state, an organization that answered to no king, only to the Pope. And their financial dealings, their secret meetings, and their incredible efficiency began to look less like the work of pious monks and more like a vast, shadowy conspiracy. The paradox of their existence was that their success in financing the defense of Christendom created powerful enemies, not on the battlefield, but in the royal palaces of Europe. They learned that a king's debt is a far more dangerous enemy than a sultan's army. But for now, their power seemed absolute, their position unassailable. The final act of their long war in the East was about to begin, and it would be their finest and most tragic hour. The end did not come with a whimper, but with the roar of trebuchets and the crash of falling towers. The year was 1291, and the city was Acre, the last great Crusader capital in the Holy Land. For 2 centuries, the Franks had clung to this sliver of coastline, but the tide of history had turned against them. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, a military power forged in the same crucible of relentless warfare as the Templars themselves, had unified the Muslim Near East and was now determined to drive the Christians into the sea once and for all. Acre was the last bastion, and at the heart of its defense, as always, were the Knights Templar. The siege of Acre in 1291 was an epic of medieval warfare, a grand and terrible spectacle. The Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, arrived with one of the largest armies the era had ever seen, equipped with a massive and sophisticated siege train. The city was packed with defenders, the garrisons of the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, supplemented by troops from Cyprus and the remnants of the kingdom's nobility. But they were hopelessly outnumbered. The defense of the city was a desperate, bloody affair, a street-by-street, tower-by-tower fight to the death. The Templars were the soul of the resistance. Their section of the wall was the strongest, and their discipline held firm amidst the chaos and panic. Their Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, a veteran warrior and a shrewd diplomat, commanded the city's defense. He organized sorties, shored up crumbling walls, and moved his elite knights to plug any breach in the line. For over a month, the defenders of Acre held off the massive Mamluk army, inflicting terrible casualties. They fought with the ferocity of cornered lions, knowing that this was the last stand. There was nowhere left to retreat to. The Mamluk siege engines, great stone-throwing machines with names like the Furious, pounded the city relentlessly, day and night. Sappers worked to undermine the walls. On May 18th, the final assault began. Mamluk forces stormed a breach in the outer wall near the aptly named Accursed Tower. A chaotic, desperate battle raged in the narrow space between the outer and inner walls. Grand Master de Beaujeu, leading a counterattack, was struck by an arrow. His knights carried him back from the walls, mortally wounded. His death was a mortal blow to the morale of the defenders. The city's fate was sealed. As the Mamluks poured into the city, the defense collapsed into a series of isolated last stands. The last bastion of resistance was the Templar Quarter, a massive, fortified compound by the sea. It was a fortress within a city. Here, the surviving Templars, along with thousands of civilians who had sought refuge with them, prepared to sell their lives dearly. For 10 more days, this small fortress held out against the entire Mamluk army. They fought from the walls, in the courtyards, and in the tower of the Grand Master. The end came on May 28th. The Mamluks, having mined the foundations of the main tower, launched a final assault. As they swarmed into the buckling structure, it collapsed, killing both the last handful of Templar defenders and the Mamluk assault troops in a single, final cataclysm of dust and stone. The red and white banner of the Templars, which had flown over the Holy Land for nearly 2 centuries, was finally extinguished. The fall of Acre marked the end of the crusading era in the East. The Templars had lost their home, their mission, their entire reason for being. Their great war was over. They had been created for the eternal defense of the Holy Land, and now the Holy Land was lost. They were an army without a war, a perfect weapon locked away in its armory, waiting for a call that would never come again. The Templars retreated to Cyprus and then back to their preceptories in Europe. But they were a changed organization, a body without a head, a war machine without a purpose. Their tragic and unjust destruction at the hands of King Philip the Fair of France is a story of politics, greed and propaganda, a different kind of war, fought in courtrooms and torture chambers, not on the battlefield. But the legend that survived them, the image that echoes down through the centuries, is not that of the banker or the heretic. It is the image forged in the dust of Montgisard and the rubble of Acre. The legend is of the warrior. The military legacy of the Knights Templar is profound. They did not invent the heavy cavalry charge, but they perfected it into a science. They demonstrated that discipline, training, and unit cohesion could be a force multiplier that allowed a smaller, professional force to defeat a larger, less organized one. They were the prototype for the modern professional army, a standing force of elite soldiers dedicated to a single cause, supported by a vast logistical and financial infrastructure. Their principles of fortification, intelligence gathering, and combined arms tactics in a medieval context were generations ahead of their time. They were, in essence, the elite special forces of the Middle Ages. Their story is a timeless lesson in the nature of power. It shows how an organization built on faith and military prowess can grow into a global entity, and how that very power can create the enemies that ultimately destroy it. The Templars were a paradox: warrior monks, pious bankers, holy killers. Their curse and their greatness were one and the same. They were perfect soldiers, created for an eternal war. When that war ended, they became obsolete, a relic of a bygone era whose very success made them a target. Their glory was born on the battlefield, and it is on the battlefield that their true story ends. The echo of their steel, the thunder of their charge, and the terrifying silence that preceded it. That is their true, immortal legacy. The Templars built their legend on unwavering discipline and brutal efficiency, a human system perfected for war. They proved that a dedicated group of individuals could become an unstoppable force. In today's world, which do you believe is the ultimate tool of power, the iron discipline of human will, capable of overcoming any obstacle through sheer dedication, or the cold logic of advanced technology which promises total control through data and automation? Let us know in the comments which weapon you think will define the conflicts of the future.